Flightless beetles on Japan's largest island show adaptive divergence within a single landmass. This is Planetterrian Daily, episode 154. Researchers examined flightless beetles that hunt snails and documented distinct body shapes tied to different habitats on the same island. The work tests whether adaptive divergence occurs within islands in addition to the classic patterns seen across separate islands. Islands function as natural laboratories where geographic isolation drives adaptation and speciation. On large islands, both distance between populations and variation in local environments can promote divergence, even without a full water barrier. Follow-up sampling across more sites on the island will clarify how consistently these shape differences track environmental gradients. Now shifting to condensed matter physics. Rice University researchers applied controlled pressure to crystals of iron sulfide and tracked simultaneous changes in its weak magnetic signal and electrical conductivity. The material belongs to a recently recognized class of magnets whose behavior differs from conventional ferromagnets. The dual response under modest squeezing provides a clearer view of the underlying electronic interactions. The result also points to a straightforward experimental handle for tuning the material's properties. Further work will map how varying pressure levels and crystal orientations affect the observed changes. On a different note, plant pathogens can cascade through ecosystems. A Murdoch University study linked the introduced plant pathogen Phytophthora dieback to poorer habitat quality for quendas in Jarrah forests. Lower habitat quality in turn decreased the animal's digging behavior, which normally turns over soil and aids nutrient cycling. The paper published in Austral Ecology shows an indirect pathway from exotic disease to changes in mammal foraging. The findings highlight how plant pathogens can cascade through ecosystems beyond their direct hosts. Continued monitoring will track whether restoration of native vegetation can reverse the decline in digging activity. Next, environmental conditions shape disease transmission in complex ways. Prolonged drought reduces the size of lakes, ponds, and wetlands, concentrating both pathogens and their hosts in smaller volumes. In some systems, this leads to higher transmission rates of water-dependent diseases, while in others, the loss of habitat reduces overall disease burden. The outcome depends on the specific ecology of the pathogen and its vectors. The study maps conditions under which water scarcity shifts from lowering to raising disease incidence. Field measurements across drought gradients will refine predictions for affected regions. Turning to cancer cell biology, research indicates that some breast cancer cells enter a dormant state and persist after initial treatment. These cells appear to shelter within specialized cellular structures that limit immune detection and drug access. The protective environment helps explain why certain cancers recur years after apparent remission. Identifying the molecular features of these shields could open new targets for eliminating residual disease. Follow-on experiments will test whether disrupting the shield components resensitizes dormant cells to therapy. On another front, a specific genetic variant alters metabolism. Individuals carrying a specific inherited variant show elevated rates of fat oxidation, even without changes in diet or exercise. The mutation appears to alter cellular energy handling pathways that favor lipid use over storage. Researchers are tracing the downstream molecular steps that produce the phenotype. The discovery provides a natural model for studying metabolic efficiency. Larger population screens will establish how common the variant is and whether it influences long-term health outcomes. Shifting to cognitive aging, a long-term observational study found that higher physical activity and better glucose regulation in midlife correlated with slower cognitive decline measured decades later. The association was particularly pronounced among Mexican-American participants. The results point to modifiable factors that may influence brain aging across different populations. Researchers note that the mechanisms likely involve vascular health and reduced inflammation. Continued follow-up of the cohort will test whether interventions begun in midlife produce measurable differences in later life cognitive trajectories. Now here is something most people get wrong about aging joints. Most people assume that resting sore or aging joints will spare them further wear. In reality, reduced movement limits the mechanical pumping that delivers nutrients to cartilage and removes waste from the joint space. Right now, as you walk or shift position, synovial fluid circulates around the cartilage surfaces, supplying oxygen and glucose that the tissue cannot obtain from blood vessels alone. A single session of moderate activity can increase this fluid exchange measurably within minutes. The next time you feel stiffness after sitting, the sensation partly reflects slowed nutrient delivery rather than damage from the movement itself. One memorable figure is that cartilage receives almost no direct blood supply, so its health depends almost entirely on this motion-driven exchange. The practical takeaway is to favor low-impact, varied movement, such as cycling, swimming, or walking on uneven ground several times a week rather than prolonged rest. Clinical guidance now emphasizes continued activity rather than rest for most people with osteoarthritis. Turning to a public health intervention, a Rutgers-led study tested whether short conversations about firearm safety changed storage intentions among gun owners. Participants who received the brief intervention showed more than double the willingness to consider temporary out-of-home storage during periods of elevated risk. The approach targets suicide prevention by reducing immediate access without requiring permanent changes in ownership. The finding indicates that low-intensity targeted discussions can shift behavior on a concrete safety practice. Larger trials will examine whether the effect holds across different regions and demographic groups. On the cardiac side, an older medication shows renewed interest. An older cardiac medication available at low cost showed an approximately 25% reduction in hospitalizations for heart failure in recent analyses. The effect appears at doses well below those historically used for rate control. Researchers are examining how the drug's influence on cellular ion handling contributes to the observed benefit. The data suggest a possible role for re-evaluating this agent in contemporary heart failure management. Larger prospective trials will determine optimal dosing and patient selection criteria. Large-scale analyses have identified subtle changes in brain activity and structure associated with widely prescribed drugs. The effects were not part of the original indications for these medications. Researchers are mapping which drug classes produce the strongest signals and whether they correlate with clinical outcomes. The work underscores the value of post-marketing surveillance that includes neuroimaging endpoints. Future studies will determine whether these brain changes warrant adjustments in prescribing for certain patient groups. In the Planetterrian spotlight, gene editing that eliminates detectable CANF1 in beagles demonstrates a direct route from molecular target to reduced allergen production. Roughly 15% of people experience allergic reactions to dogs, primarily from the CANF1 protein in saliva. Researchers used gene editing to disrupt production of this protein in beagles and then measured allergen levels in saliva and dander. Early tests found no detectable CANF1 in the edited animals. The approach offers a potential route to reduce allergen exposure without requiring owners to avoid dogs or rely solely on immunotherapy. Additional studies will assess long-term health of the dogs and confirm the absence of the allergen under varied conditions. The work sits within ongoing efforts to apply precise genome modification to common environmental triggers rather than treating symptoms after exposure. If the edited animals remain healthy over longer periods, the approach could inform similar strategies for other allergens. Before we go, keep an eye on how drought gradients continue to reshape pathogen dynamics in field studies expected next month. That's Planetterrian Daily for today. If you enjoyed this, a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really helps new listeners find the show. I'm Patrick in Vancouver. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets. Each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Tesla Shorts Time, your daily deep dive into everything Tesla. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. Following the long arcs, story trackers on naranetwork.com follow major programs across episodes: Tesla, SpaceX, AI, space science, and more. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.